Good morning. This morning we're here out almost on Lake Florida at Deb Nelson's house. She has beautiful windows overlooking the marsh area and Shakopee Creek. It's an ideal setting for indoor houseplants, and this is why today we'll focus on some possible plants that you can have in your home. Now, they won't always look like Deb's beautiful examples here, but I'll introduce the other master gardeners. Deb Nelson is a fairly new one, and Bonita Callisted, who has been with us before. And we have an examples of the house plants here on the table. And Bonita has a few questions, and so I'll turn it over to her.
Well, and I think you'll see that the plants vary with the different types of care. And I think we'll let Deb give us an idea of how she has decided which plants that she likes to bring in to her home.
Good morning. Well, I experiment with the plants. A good number of the plants people have given me because they're tired of them or sometimes they don't know what to do with them. For instance, the shrimp plants, they came in the middle of summer. My husband saw them at a greenhouse and they were on sale and he felt sorry for them. And they're basically an outside annual, but I did my research on them, and online it said they also make nice house plants. So I brought it in. And this has been in since before frost, and I do continue to fertilize. Many plants in winter you don't fertilize, but this one I have. And as you can see, it's sending out more blossoms. The blossom part of this is this little white part. And they're very messy, and they don't last long, but they continue to add color, which amuses me in winter. And the begonia, I was given that, maybe 5 years ago, after its time decorating a church was over. And I put it outside every year, and it just didn't do very well last year outside. And I thought, well, I don't have much to lose. So I brought it in with a lot of the other plants I bring in every year. And it started to have more blossoms than it did outside. So I have kind of a plant hospital down in my lower level. And when it started to look good, I brought it up, continued to fertilize it, and it just keeps gifting me with nice color for the winter. And the orchids, of course, they've been kind of my guilty hobby for many years. This green one always seems to like to bloom in January and February, but then it lasts for 4 months, sometimes 5. And I bought that by mail from Hawaii many, many years ago. It's probably almost 20 years ago. And it's extremely hardy. Most of the other orchids kind of give up or get overwatered. And one of the reasons I like this one particularly is it has a very light fragrance, which is just nice.
I have a couple questions about the orchids. People think that they're very exotic and difficult to grow, and yet you see them in supermarkets. You see them all over the world, really. And so look like you've done a very successful job. They have these white or gray, they almost look like fingers or something growing out of them along with the large leathery green leaves. And so what is the key to success in growing orchids?
Patience. When you buy them, they're gorgeous, but many of them have been raised in a greenhouse, so they have a very kind of narrow temperature and conditions that they've been used to. And many of them do very well for a month or two at home, but a lot of times then they look done. And without the flower, they aren't terribly attractive. And it depends on the plant. Sometimes when it is done blooming, I find this works maybe better with plants that you've gotten as a gift, so they still have good energy. Sometimes when the stalk is still green when the flowers are gone. If you cut it up at about the second node, sometimes it'll send out another shoot and you'll have another whole series of blooms. They last.
I was going to ask you if you have a technique for watering the orchids, because many people can overwater and kill the orchids. Do you lift them to see if they're light? Do you stick your finger in the pot, or do you have like a little moisture meter that helps you, or do you just kind of have a schedule?
I baby them. Some get watered more than others. And like I said, they're my guilty pleasure. I collect rainwater for them during the summer, and I bottle it, and it's in the basement. And with the orchids, I water them weekly, kind of, but weekly, with a lower amount of fertilizer than is called for on the package. And it depends what they're potted in. Some are in sphagnum moss, some are in the bark medium. So it sometimes depends, but I let them get dry for the most part. I think the problem most people have with orchids is they rot the roots. They water them too much. For instance, this one is in a solid pot, and I turn it into almost a ritual. I have a big silver pan that I use, and I put the ones that have drain holes in the pot, water them well, and then lift it so that water doesn't sit. In a solid pot, I'll water them, let it sit a few seconds, not too long, and then I drain it. A lot of times you have the ice cube orchids, and so people drop in a few ice cubes, and that's fine, but the quality of the water, who knows? And if they're not adding any fertilizer, you're not really encouraging. It'll keep it alive, but that's about it.
Do you have some orchids that you need to put at a lower temperature for several weeks of the year? Because I know I have some that need about 6 weeks of about a 10-degree lower temperature so that they will send out their flower shoots. Have you noticed that?
Generally, I mean, you can be a little pickier and try to make that move, but we live in Minnesota, and when it's winter, it's generally a few degrees, maybe not always 10, but it's cooler next to the windows. So sometimes they might get enough just if you leave them close to a window. I found that I think I have less than 20 orchids now. At times I've had more, but if heat goes out in your house, if it hits 50 for a few hours, sometimes that's enough to put them into decline. But generally, I've had most of my orchids for at least, I haven't had any new ones. I have 5 to 10 years on most of them.
Speaking of watering plants and watering orchids, the technique that Deb mentioned is a wonderful idea. When you water a plant, any house plant, or even plants outside, after the water goes through, to drain, they always have a drain hole in them to drain out the extra water so they're not sitting in water for several days. It makes for a healthier plant, and also there'll be less of a chance that they'll be drowning in the water that you use.
I was wondering if you wanted to turn now to the amaryllis and give us a little idea about if you have them outside first or inside first, or how you start your amaryllis.
I've always loved the amaryllis. And so many times you get them as gifts on the holiday season, and you put them in a pot, and you hope and you pray, and sometimes you get a beautiful bloom, and sometimes you don't. And I actually have 2 different kinds of amaryllis. If you can see the small petal in the middle of this one, and then you look at the middle petal of this one, and it's much thicker. Years ago, I bought just a pot of household amaryllis from a lady at church, and she said they had come from her grandmother. And the interesting thing about them is they send up a whole bunch of little bulblets at their bases, whereas I think the bulbs you get from the Dutch growers now are hybridized, and the colors are gorgeous. And sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't. What I enjoy, though, after they're done, I move them back downstairs, and usually in spring, I'll repot them just in big pots like this, put them outside for the summer, and water, fertilize, and then in winter, I will dump the pots. Sometimes I try to repot the biggest bulbs in smaller pots, and if I'm not sure, I'll just put them all in a new pot. And it's great in winter when it is so cold and dreary to have a series of amaryllis that just keep blooming, because I've gone through maybe 3 pots of them already, and these 3 are now, and I've got 2 more with blooms coming up in the other room. So they're fun.
Well, and it's a very popular holiday item that people want to start in their homes. They're not sure how you do it. You buy a bulb in a box, essentially, and so then there's some sketchy directions with it. But you can see, actually, if you keep these for many years, how beautiful they become. And Deb mentioned this one where there's all kinds of little bulbs, tiny bulbs, and leaves that have come up around the main one. And so it's it's something that you might want to experiment with. I do want to mention something that I don't see here, but I don't have a lot of house plants, but I do grow, I have a couple of Christmas cactus that I grow, and those are also a little tricky. So I'm going to turn this over. I usually put them outside in a shady area in the summer, bring them in the fall, and then they'll bloom in November and then again in the spring, the variety that I have. So do either of you have Christmas cactus?
No.
Okay. How about you? All right.
I do. Now, I just leave mine in the house year round, but I pay attention to the window that I have it in, and mine is a west-facing window, and I think also I watch the water so I don't overwater it. Like you mentioned before, if you overwater your houseplants, you're going to just kill the roots. And the Christmas cactus seems to be a very easy plant to grow in the house and rewards you with many, many blossoms. So I've been very pleased with it.
The other interesting thing that I've heard from people is the longevity of the Christmas cactus. Some people will say, well, I got this one from my grandma, and I had one that I got from my aunt. I brought it back on the plane from South Carolina. She had gotten it from a relative. And so if you take the little leaves, and you can bring them almost anywhere, and you can keep them for years. But again, as Benita said, the temperature makes a big difference. Mine are in a cool spot downstairs, and they get daylight they get sunlight during the day. And then I also am very careful about watering them. Not to overwater, just make sure that you touch the soil and it's dry. Time to be watered, and then drain the water out before. I don't fertilize mine. I'm pretty picky about over-fertilizing my plants. A lot of time the potting soil has a plant food in it. And so if that is the case, then be careful you don't over-fertilize, or you will get a lot of massive green, but not a lot of flowers. So anyway, anything else that you see on this level that we would like to talk about?
A lot of the plants that you don't see are in the photo are just, many of the plants I have that are here year-round are the same things most people have, the philodendrons and Schefflera?
I'm not sure about
that. Which is just too big to go moving around, and against light you wouldn't see it anyway.
You also have poinsettia, and we didn't really focus on the poinsettia, but a lot of people try to keep that over. And in fact, I have a friend who will actually put it outside in the summer and then bring it in the fall and the new blossoms. I haven't had a lot of success with that myself. I'd rather just put it in the compost and then get a new one in the fall. But maybe Deb can talk about that.
I have put it out, brought it in fall, and then followed the directions where you put it in complete darkness. And it was an awful lot of work doing that for a month or more, getting up at crack of dawn, getting it into the light, making sure it had the required amount, and then putting it back into complete darkness. And I did get the red leaves on it, but at the price you can buy them for, it wasn't worth all the work, and it wasn't as pretty as the ones you buy, so.
All right, anything else? We're going to go down to the lower level in just a few minutes. And Bev has some interesting plants, including the popcorn plant, which you can see at our county fair. I just wanted to point that out. She does bring it in the winter. And so you'll have a close-up of the popcorn plant and some others that she puts outside, brings in. And we'll also talk about any problems she might have with pests. Coming in with plants from the outdoors or developing inside, which can happen. So, Benita, do you have a couple more comments?
I would think that we'll also be covering whether you plant some seeds for the spring, and if you have an ideal location or any suggestions on that, and that's probably something we'll also cover when we're downstairs.
We've gathered together now downstairs, and it's a perfect location for wintering over plants that you might want to put outside. But also, I know that Deb will talk a little bit about a couple of examples that she's had where she's had some pests that she's had to treat. And one of the things that she does is to isolate them from the other plants, which is always a good plan. If you see anything that's growing on your plants or making webs or anything that might cause distress to the plant, then the first step is to isolate it away from the rest of the plants. But tell us what else that you have done.
When it comes to keeping them? Or, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
getting rid of the pests.
Getting rid of the pests.
Yeah.
Usually I bring my outside plants down, I put them out on my little patio, and I mix up the appropriate amount of, I can't remember the name of it, the stuff that you spray to help them for the winter. And I treat them outside and let them sit so it dries, because I don't like the smell anyway. And follow the recommendations on the bottle, that's always important. And then bring them in for the winter. But even when you do, sometimes some plants are just more prone. The hibiscus I had last year, I finally just threw them out because I'd followed everything, but I think they are just much more prone to gathering pests. I don't know if it's in the soil or what, but the hibiscus that my husband got me this year, I decided I wasn't going to go through that. I looked for different ways to keep them over winter, and one of them was to cut them off like you would a lot of your outside plants. I did treat them after I cut them off, so I didn't have as much branch and leaf to deal with. And then I put them in a window in one of the downstairs bedrooms. They were up to a zone 5, so they should be just fine there. I water them very carefully. Probably after February 11th, which is what, Greenhouse Day? That's the day when people in greenhouses tend to see that their plants start responding better to the sun. I'll probably put in just a tad of fertilizer, much below the recommended amount, and start watering them as carefully, but see if they start to grow. Now I've seen just little, like pin pricks of new shoots starting. So that's an experiment that I'm doing with those. But I tend to experiment with plants a lot.
I think that experimenting with plants is why we're gardeners. I don't know. That's the way my whole yard is, as a matter of fact. But again, we're inside. It's in the winter time, and we're looking at some other examples. Deb has brought in, and also some of these really large plants. The popular popcorn plant is over here, but I will let Deb or Bonita explain a little bit about some of these. I'm not really sure about the names of all of them, but I know that they're fairly easy to grow as houseplants.
I don't know if I'd call the popcorn plant an easy plant for. No, it's a zone 9, and in tropical areas it can reach 20 feet. And I was again gifted with 6 of them by my dear husband. He thought they looked pretty. So they sat out in the middle in pots in my garden last fall, and I took them to the fair, and people really liked them. It's something that the kids could come up with, and they could pull on the leaves, and it smelled just like buttered popcorn. And when they bloom, they have a lovely yellow flower, and you might have a picture of that will work. But I brought them in just to experiment with them. One of the plants developed what looked like maybe a spider mite infestation at the very top, and I took it out of this room, put it in another cold room, put some insecticide spray in a bag and put that over it. So that's another experiment. We'll see how these do through the winter, and I'll put them out again next year. This kind of ugly looking thing down there is a bromeliad called Queen's Tears. It was given to me by a friend in the cities, and she called it her Christmas orchid. And I looked at it and I said, that is no orchid. It was very homely. So it took, a month or two talking to different people and looking in various books to figure out what it was. And the reason it was called Christmas anything is that it does bloom right around Christmas. It doesn't bloom for long, but there's a picture I sent Bonita, so you might be able to see it in its glory. Right now it just kind of looks like brown hangy things, but when the spikes come up, they're bright pink and very showy, and then they get this nice curve, and it almost looks like a big blue dangly earring. So they're another fun plant for winter enjoyment. And all of these are what everyone gets, the spike plant they put in the middle of their planters. And many years ago, these monsters were just little ones like that you pay a couple dollars for at the local nurseries. But I hate to see anything die if it doesn't have to. So I started bringing them in, and they just keep getting bigger and showier. And that's, I repot them every year and put them out, and they're a nice big showy piece. So I'm starting again with those. And this year I had beautiful pots with the red form of the plant, and we'll see if they continue too. I took them out of their pots and put them all together. I had some geraniums in there, which they were really pretty. I'm not sure if the geraniums, I'm trying a different method because I only have so much room to put things, but we'll see what they do. I also tried to do the recommended way of storing for the sweet potato vines. So that'll be another experiment to see what works.
I notice that you've got your geranium in the pot, and it's nice and green. Do you also do the method where you take the geranium and you just let it go dormant for the winter? There's different ways of dealing with geraniums over the winter.
No, I have got, probably 10 geraniums in the garage in various methods. So they need to be checked to see if they're still moist. But the garage door was left open a little too long one day, so it's kind of we'll just see what happens.
I know, Deb, you've mentioned many times now putting the plants in new pots. I think that will be a question a lot of people have, is when do plants need to be repotted? And most of the, almost every indoor plant is in a type of pot. I see you have a mix of plastic as well as clay pots. I know the idea a few years ago used to be that the clay pots were better because it just held the moisture differently than plastic does. But I've found success with anything I use as long as I don't overwater. So maybe you could tell people a little bit about what to look for when they think they need to repot a plant.
Well, when you design your outside pots in spring, usually you have what the guy on TV says, what a thriller, a chiller, and a spiller. And they're not all going to be usable the next year. I think we all love something that's tall to give it a little bit of dimension, and we all love the color, so something like the geraniums or some of the many beautiful plants you find at the nurseries to give color. I mean, people love petunias. I'm not fond of them. I get them anyway because some of the new varieties last a long time, and if you continue to deadhead, they just keep producing, and they're great. And then the sweet potato vines, I like them. And there's other things that do beautiful hanging from the baskets too. But I've read that the sweet potato vines, along with some of the other bulb things like, glads and cannas, if you clean them off, kind of let them dry a little bit, and pack them correctly for the winter, you put them back the next year and they come back gangbusters. I mean, I don't know if you can see in the back of this pot, I must have missed a little bit of the sweet potato vine, and it just started up on its own. Because usually I have, 4, 5, 6 of these green pots, and in fall when things have to come in or freeze, I dump them all out, and instead of one of these tall ones in a pot, I will put 3 or 4 or whatever fits in the pot so I can bring it in, because there's just no room to bring in 30 pots.
So again, my question was, how does a person tell when something needs to be repotted? Normally what I do, and you can do this at a nursery too, I'm sure they don't appreciate this, but pick up the plant and see what the root looks like. And if it looks like it's getting root bound, you've got to get it out of that size pot. And I've gotten into the habit of doing that in the nurseries. I don't think they like it, but it's probably the only way you can get a healthy plant to bring home with you and then put in a new pot.
I think with a lot of plants, that is the first thing you really should do. Is usually you can just pop it out of the plant, out of the pot, just bang it a little bit, little bop on the bottom, and take a look at the roots. Sometimes roots, you have no idea how long that plant has been at the nursery. And sometimes it's been there a while. It may have been there years for things like shrubs. And I don't like to leave them in the nursery pots at all. A lot of times what you plan to do is combine it with other things anyway. And if it's too root bound, it's never going to do well for you. And it hurts sometimes, but you need to scrape the side of the root, pull them down, and you have no idea how old the soil is. So repotting is important.
It is. In fact, I know that you can take a knife and kind of dig in, and score the especially a shrub or a tree, and make sure that you loosen those roots up before you either put them in the ground or put them in a larger pot, because they won't absorb the nutrition from the soil, and they won't absorb the water correctly if you put them in the ground. So that's always a good tip.
Now, do you also plan ahead for the next growing season and start a few seeds indoors, or start breaking off some plants to propagate some more plants?
Isn't that what spring is? I think we all have about a foot-high stack of garden books and sort through and try to figure out what worked well for you and what didn't. I tend to like to start a lot of my own because it's always very hard to tell if nursery plants have been treated with systemics. And I have bees, so I'm very conscious of things that might kill my bees. So I love just the sweet alyssum is just such a great filler, and it will reseed itself. I love the pansies, although pansies I usually buy because they take so long to start on your own. Marigolds are always great, but I love to go through every year and see if there's colors or varieties. Some annuals are great because you can just pop them outside. You can start some inside, pop some outside later, and then they just continue the whole year.
I think you made a good point about that how some plants need to be started much earlier. So it's really, if you're buying the seeds, it's really important to take a look at the pack of the seed packet and see when they say to start it and the conditions.
Well, and how soon you can put it out. You always want to have a great garden to start with, but if you put it out too soon, it's going to freeze.
As you can see, with 3 master gardeners here, we have a lot to say. And we have a lot to say about potted plants. We have a lot to say about gardening. We haven't even talked about gardening yet, but we won't today. We'll hold off on that and look back on that in the spring. But I wondered if either of you had some last messages to leave?
Plant what you love, because if you want a plant to do well, it has to have good care. And I check mine every day. I baby them.
And I find that other people who like gardening are also willing to share, and they enjoy if you share with them. So it's often fun to to divide a plant and pass it on to a friend, or to say, gee, can I get a little sprig of that? And it's a great way to share the gardening fun.
Yes, and when a group of gardeners get together, as the 3 of us have today, and you can imagine what it is when the master gardeners have their meeting. And again, if you love plants, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of plant knowledge. And if you are interested, we welcome new members to the Master Gardener program. You would have to be looking at next year to start, because our program has already started in January. But again, it is a program that offers you rewards. We are very helpful to each other. Something that we may not all know, we can share our information. And so here we are, 3 master gardeners. We have Deb, and we have Bonita, and we have Susan, saying that we will see you again